everyone's hearing with that. But Dean Russ captured that in this quote when he said, "I just don't believe it was an accident or trigger-happy local commanders. It was just too much of a sustained effort to disable and sink the Liberty." But it wasn't just politicians who disputed Israel's explanation. Senior leaders of the intelligence community also were convinced the attack was no accident. Dick Helms, who was CIA director at the time, said, quote, I don't think there can be any doubt that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing. Marshall Carter, who's the director of the NSA, said, quote, it couldn't be anything else but deliberate. And Tom Hughes, who headed the State Department's Intelligence Bureau, told me, quote, we were quite convinced that the Israelis knew what they were doing. And, of course, many senior Navy officers refused to believe Israel. Vice Admiral Jerome King, who in 1967 was the senior aide to the CNO at that time, Admiral David McDonald, specifically challenges the idea that this was a friendly fire attack in this quote that he told me in the course of my research. Quote, it certainly was not mistaken identity. I don't buy it. I never did. Nobody that I knew ever did either. It wasn't as though it was at night or a rainy day or anything like that. There wasn't any excuse for not knowing what the ship was. You could divine from just the apparatus on deck, all the antennae and so on, what its mission was. So how did Israeli pilots fail to identify the Liberty? How, over multiple strafing passes, often at low altitudes, had no pilot noticed the spy ship's unique markings or American flag? After all, Egyptian ships are marked in Arabic script, not Western letters. Transcripts of Israeli communications that have become available only in recent years show that the case is not as simple as the Israeli government wanted the Americans to believe in 1967. This excerpt from pilot communication shows that 2 minutes before the strafing began, a weapons system officer in General Headquarters blurted out, "What is it? Americans?" Despite doubts raised about the ship's identity, Israel's chief air controller neither halted the impending assault nor ordered his fighters to look for identifying markings or a flag as the plane zeroed in on the Liberty. These abbreviated excerpts show the excitement and exuberance both pilots and air controllers shared as the attack on the Liberty unfolded. A pilot joked at one point during the strafing run that hitting the defenseless ship was easier than shooting down MiGs. Another, as you can see here, quipped that it would be a mitzvah, a blessing or a kind deed, to sink the Liberty before the Navy arrived. Is he screwing her? The chief air controller asked at one point. He's going down on her with napalm all the time, answered another. Shortly before the planes exhausted all their ammunition, the chief air controller finally asked the pilots to look for a flag. One of the pilots buzzed the ship moments later and spotted the Liberty's hull number. He radioed it to ground control. As these transcripts show, any doubt over the ship's identity vanished. What country? Probably American. What? Probably American. At that point in time, in my mind, it was an American ship. I was sure it was an American ship. Those are the words of Lieutenant Colonel Kislev, who was Israel's head air controller at that time. Israel had conclusively identified the Liberty as much as 26 minutes before the fatal torpedo strike. According to Israeli documents, that report was passed to the Israeli Navy, where the Vice Chief of Naval Operations dismissed it as camouflage writing in order to allow an Egyptian ship to enter the area. Israeli documents also show that at least 2 other Israeli naval officers suspected that before the torpedo attack, the ship they were zeroing in on was none other than the Liberty that they had seen that same morning. Neither intervened to halt the attack. On board the Liberty at that time, far below deck, sailors burned classified materials, bagged up magnetic tapes, and destroyed key cards until word was passed to stand by for a torpedo attack. At that point, they stopped what they were doing. They buttoned up their shirts, tucked their pants legs into their socks to protect against flash burn, and lay down on the deck. Many prayed. One sailor, who didn't want to see what was about to happen, took off his glasses and put them in the front pocket of his shirt. At 2:35 p.m., the torpedo struck, and in an instant, ended the lives of more than 24 men. Israeli Ambassador Avram Harman read these details coming off reports in the Israeli embassy in Washington, and he told his superiors in Jerusalem that he believed several parties were guilty of negligence. Harman, in this telegram to the Prime Minister actually, demanded that Israel prosecute the attackers. At one point, he even suggested that they invite American journalists to Israel to cover the trial. As he wrote in his telegram here, in a severe situation created, the only way to soften the results is if we could let the U.S. government know already today we intend to prosecute people in connection with this disaster. Meanwhile, 6 days after the attack, the full scope of what we now know as a preventable torpedo attack finally became clear as the Liberty limped into Malta for repairs. At sea, only the top few feet of the torpedo hole were visible, as you can see here, a little spot there below where the men are. Once in dry dock, however, the full scope of the damage became clear. The teardrop-shaped hole measured 24 feet tall and 39 feet wide. The men in the foreground actually give you some perspective on the size of the hole. This is the first time this photograph's ever been showed publicly. I just got it in an email from a Liberty sailor about a week ago who read the book. He's never been to any of the Liberty reunions or whatnot, but he sent me an email saying that he had these photographs and forwarded this along and gave me permission to share it. So it's a very powerful photo, I think, and one of the best, I think, that really captures just how large that torpedo hole really was. So violent was that torpedo's explosion that it literally vaporized some of the men, prompting Liberty skipper William McGonigal to have to write this painful condolence letter to some of the families. Quote, "It is with profound regret that your husband's body was lost at sea and is unrecoverable, or has not yet been positively identified." Back in Washington, the Liberty soon became a political tug of war between Israel and the United States. Soon after the attack, Secretary of State Dean Rusk sent Israel's ambassador a stinging letter, describing the attack as, quote, "quite literally incomprehensible," and arguing that it represented, quote, "wanton disregard for human life." Rusk demanded Israel punish the attackers. Israeli diplomats feared the United States planned to use the attack on the Liberty as a political tool to dampen the American public's support of Israel, which was running at a high during the Six-Day War. This was very dangerous ground for Israel at a time with the war now over, and as they were going to have to deal with controversial issues like territorial gains and refugee status. So Israel decided to fight back, as this excerpt from a telegram shows, launching their own political and media spin campaign. This is a letter to their foreign ministry saying, quote, "Our informative process must avoid confrontation with the United States since it's clear the American public, if faced with a direct argument, will accept its government's version." Israeli diplomats tapped influential American Jews who were close friends of President Johnson's for help. Documents show that Eugene Rostow, who was third in command of the State Department at that time, repeatedly shared privileged information about American strategy on handling the Liberty with Israeli diplomats, essentially giving them the upper hand. Rostow's support effect of Israel was so pronounced during the entire Six-Day War that Tom Hughes, the director of the State Department's Intelligence Bureau, told me in an interview that Rostow acted as though he were a defense lawyer for the Israelis at this time. Others who assisted the diplomats were Abe Fortas, Supreme Court Justice, and Arthur Goldberg, who was the United States' ambassador to the United Nations at that time. This telegram not only shows the great influence Israeli diplomats had over the American media, in this case able to kill a potential news story, but it also shows how terrified diplomats were of a potential congressional investigation, which would require Liberty sailors testifying, the story landing back on the front pages, etc. And so this was a telegram actually from their foreign ministry back to Jerusalem saying, quote, "A reliable journalistic source informs that the authorized Democratic representative from New York, Otis Pipe, member of the Armed Forces Committee, is under pressure by his constituency to investigate the incident. We've made sure that the journalistic source will refrain from writing about this for now." This telegram is another that shows how Israeli diplomats worked the media to kill critical stories and slant others in favor of Israel. The day after the attack, President Johnson met in the White House for an off-the-record interview with a Newsweek reporter, in which he told this reporter that he believed Israel deliberately attacked the Liberty to prevent it from spying. Israeli officials in their embassy learned the details of Johnson's interview within 24 hours and began pressuring Newsweek to tone down its story about the leak, which, as you can see from this telegram, Newsweek did. Quote, "The Newsweek editorial has made changes in the last proofreading of the news item compared with the original version that I was shown last night. It toned down the version by adding a question mark to the heading, leaving out the words deliberate attack, and a commentary paragraph that said the leak is intended to free American policymakers from the pressure of pro-Israel public opinion." And that's actually the headline that ran in Newsweek. But diplomats also needed to tone down President Johnson, who was out talking to the reporters and giving them his personal views and whatnot. And this is a telegram actually that shows that. So in order to pressure Johnson, diplomats proposed, if necessary, accusing him of blood libel. The embassy tapped Abe Fortas and Washington lawyer David Ginsburg to make sure Johnson got the message. And as the historical record shows, he did.
Worn out by the Middle East crisis in Vietnam, Johnson looked for a compromise that would guarantee that American families were compensated, yet not risk a clash with Israel and its domestic supporters. So he ordered Nicholas Katzenbach, second in command of the State Department at that point, to negotiate a deal. If Israel publicly apologized for the attack and paid reparations, America would let it go. No more questions asked. So in this quote that is from an interview I had with Katzenbach, he summed up the president's reasoning on this. He said, quote, "His thinking on it was the more generous they were about admitting a mistake and paying reparations, paying off the families, the easier it would be for the United States to ignore the incident." The administration's decision not to dig into the Liberty was evident in the incredibly weak effort the Navy made to investigate the attack. Shallow, cursory, and perfunctory were words Liberty officers all used to describe the court of inquiry, which spent 2 days interviewing crew members in Malta for an investigation into an attack that had killed 34 men. The transcript of those proceedings showed just how shallow it truly was. The Liberty's chief engineer was asked only 13 questions. A chief petty officer who was on deck during the air attack and a good witness about it was asked only 11 questions. Another one of the ship's officers was asked only 5. The final transcript of all this testimony was only 158 pages. And my wife's a lawyer, and she's told me that she's had a single deposition run longer than 158 pages. So in the end, the Liberty's entire court of inquiry was completed in just 8 days, less time than it took to bury some of the dead. It's important to note that that 8 days included travel time for the Navy's senior officers to fly from London to Malta, interview the crew members, return to London, deliberate, and type up the final report. But in evaluating the Liberty's Court of Inquiry, it's worth comparing it to that of the Pueblo. Okay. The Liberty's Court of Inquiry lasted 8 days, interviewed only 14 witnesses, and it was only 158 pages. The Pueblo Court of Inquiry would last 3.5 months, interview 104 witnesses, and produce a transcript that was nearly 3,400 pages long. Back in Washington, Deputy Defense Secretary Cyrus Vance oversaw the Pentagon's effort to condense the Liberty's Court of Inquiry into a declassified summary that they could give out to the press and the families. It was important that the Court of Inquiry support Israel's version of events and not raise questions. So the overt effort by Vance's office to protect Israel from the potential public relations fallout soon angered senior Navy officers. This is a handwritten memo I found in the Navy's archives by Chief of Naval Operations Admiral David McDonald that he wrote after reading the draft prepared for the public by Vance's office, in which he wrote, I've translated his handwriting there, but I think that much of this is extraneous, and it leaves me with the feeling that we're trying our best to excuse the attackers. Were I a parent of one of the deceased, this release would burn me up. I myself do not subscribe to it. Likewise, Cyrus Vance clashed with NSA Director Marshall Carter when the two men were summoned before a secret meeting of the Committee of the House Appropriations Committee. When asked whether he believed Israel deliberately targeted the Liberty, Carter responded, quote, "It couldn't be anything else but deliberate." Afterward, Vance pulled Carter aside and ordered him to, quote, "keep his mouth shut." The implication was clear. Regardless of the opinions of Carter and other senior NSA leaders, Vance demanded that these men remain silent. NSA Chief of Staff Jerry Burke, whom I interviewed in the course of my research, told me precisely that in an interview, as you can see here. Quote, "There was absolutely no question in anybody's minds that the Israelis had done it deliberately. I was angry because of the cover-up, if that's possible, than of the incident itself, because there was no doubt in my mind that they did it right from the outset. That was no mystery. The only mystery to me was why was this thing being covered up." American officials had hoped that Israel would punish the attackers, as Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Israeli Ambassador Avraham Harman had demanded. In August, American officials learned that the Israeli judge tasked to examine the attack instead had exonerated everyone. The assault on the Liberty, which raged for an hour, clear afternoon in international waters, was the most violent attack on an American warship since World War II. Yet Israel's investigating judge could find no evidence of wrongdoing, no negligence, no violation of military procedure. American officials slammed that decision, as evidenced by this handwritten memo by Dr. Luis Tordella, the NSA's deputy director, in which he wrote, quote, he's writing this about their investigation. "A nice whitewash for a group of ignorant, stupid, and inept XXXXX.
If the attackers had not been Hebrew, there would have been quite a commotion.
Such crass stupidity, 30 knots, warship, 2 guns, etc., does not even do credit to the Nigerian Navy. Tordello's memo reflected the special treatment many in Washington recognized that Israel received in the aftermath of the attack on the Liberty. The failure to reprimand anyone left lingering resentment among many in the United States. Vice Chief of Naval Operations at that time, Admiral Horatio Rivera, was later asked for his most prominent memory of the attack on the Liberty, and he responded with one sentence: "My anger and frustration at our not punishing the attackers." 74 days after the torpedo ripped open the side of the Liberty and nearly 6,000 miles from where it happened, the remains of 5 sailors and 1 Marine were laid to rest in a mass grave in Arlington. The single casket that you see here held little more than bone fragments and tissue shoveled into body bags 2 months earlier in Malta. Even in the burial of the last of the Liberty veterans, the government was careful to downplay precisely how these men were killed. That was evident by the headstone that simply read, quote, "died in the Eastern Mediterranean." In 1982, however, after pressure from the Liberty veterans, the government changed that headstone to read, quote, "killed USS Liberty." The administration's effort to de-emphasize the Liberty also spilled over into the presentation of awards in June 1968. Liberty skipper William McGonigal was nominated for the Medal of Honor, an award customarily presented by the President at the White House. President Johnson in 1968 had presented at least 9 Medals of Honors to recipients at the White House, but McGonigal would not be so lucky. The Liberty remained too politically sensitive. As this memo shows that I found in the LBJ library, Johnson's senior military aide, James Cross, urged the president not to present McGonigal's medal in person and to make sure the White House issued no press release. Instead, McGonigal was presented the Medal of Honor in a low-key ceremony at the Washington Navy Yard. Rather than honor McGonigal with the nation's highest award for heroism, Johnson, who at that time was less than 4 miles away in the White House, opted instead to hand out diplomas to graduates of the Capitol Page High School. In 1968, Israel paid $3.3 million to the families of the men killed. A year later, they paid another $3 million to the men who were injured, but then balked at paying the $7.6 million for the loss of the Liberty, which was ultimately scrapped. At one point, Israel offered a token sum of $100,000 to settle the debt, but the United States refused. Negotiations dragged on until 1980, and by then the bill for the Liberty had grown to more than $17 million with interest. Under threat of a congressional investigation, Israel struck a deal to pay $6 million in 3 annual installments, and Jimmy Carter's administration accepted that. Despite the argument of some that Israel's payment of reparations effectively closed the book on the Liberty, the attack and our government's handling of the affair are still very much a daily part of many lives. Chris Armstrong, whose father was Liberty XO Phil Armstrong, Naval Academy graduate class of 1953, sent me this email not too long ago and gave me permission to share it with you all. He says, quote, "I was one of the recipients of cash from Israel, just recycled USA money, I'm sure, $52,000. However, no money can replace a father, especially at age 3. It paid for my college education, but not much else. I would give it all back, and then some. My emotional scars are very deep from this incident." So, thank you very much for having me today.